This is tape recordings being made February 3rd, 1969, in the home of Frank Herbert in Fairfax, California. Frank and his wife, Bev, are sitting around. Myself, Dr. Willis McNelly of Cal State English Department in Fullerton, California, sitting around talking about science fiction. And Frank Herbert, as we all know, is the author of Dune and many other science fiction novels. Frank, I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about the origins of Dune. You started a little bit earlier, and you said you could trace the germinal idea.
Oh, yes. The idea came from an article. I was going to do an article, which I never did, about the control of sand dunes. What many people don't realize is that the United States has pioneered in this, how to control the flow of sand dunes. And it started up here at Florence, Oregon. There is a pilot project up there of the U.S. Forest Service, which has been so successful that it has been visited and copied by experts, related departments from Chile, Israel, India, Pakistan, Great Britain, several other countries.
Well, I know I drove along the Oregon coast this summer, and you had mentioned this a year ago that it had begun with this, what was happening along Oregon. And I remember stopping at one fort there right south of the Columbia River. It's a Oregon State Park now.
That's a story. Well, Florence is considerably south of that.
South of that.
Yeah. It's about centrally located on the Oregon coast.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an area where sand dunes blew across Highway 1, U.S. Highway 1, frequently blocking the highway.
Mm-hmm.
And the Forest Service put in a test station down there to determine how they could control the flow of these sand dunes. And I got fascinated by sand dunes because I'm always fascinated by the idea of something that is either seen in miniature and then can be expanded to the macrocosm,
mm-hmm.
or which, but for the difference in time, in the flow rate and the entropy rate,
mm-hmm.
Is similar to other features which we wouldn't think were similar.
Like how long ago was this, by the way?
Oh, this was in 53. This was considerably...
15 years ago.
Yeah, this was a long time ago. Sand dunes are like waves in a large body of water. They just are slower. And the people treating them as fluid learn to control them.
Fluid mechanics, in other words.
That was fluid mechanics with sand.
Very
And the whole idea fascinated me, so I started researching sand dunes. And, of course, from sand dunes, it's a logical idea to go into a desert. And the way I accumulate data is I start building file folders. And before long, I saw that I had far too much for an article and far too much for a story, for a short story. So I didn't know really what I had, but I had an enormous amount of data and avenues shooting off at all angles to gather more, and I was following them. I can't read the dictionary, I can't go look up a word. I get stopped by everything else on the opposite page. But so I started accumulating these file folders, which I'll show you later. And as a result, I finally saw that I had something enormously interesting going for me about the ecology of deserts. And it was, for a science fiction writer anyway, it was an easy step from that to think, what if I had an entire planet that was a desert? And during my studies of deserts, of course, and previous studies of religions, we all know that many religions began in a desert atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided to put the two together because I don't think that any one story should have any one thread.
Mm-hmm.
I build on a layer technique. And of course, putting in religion and religious ideas with ecological ideas, you can play one against the other.
Mm-hmm.
Now this is, you see, I'm talking about the surface now.
That's right.
I'm not talking about the way things are layered down
within the
into
novel
surface
itself.
That's right, yeah. and the way character is developed for various reasons in the story. This is just the germ of the idea. But that's where it began.
It began 15 years ago then. Well, what made you, or at what point did you go from the sand dunes of Oregon and the ecological background there to the decision to utilize, let's say, the Arabian mystique as another counter notion or contrapuntal notion working within the novel?
Well, of course, in studying sand dunes, you immediately get into not just the Arabian mystique, but the Navajo mystique and the mystique of the Kalahari primitives. And
Kalahari primitives?
Yeah, the Kalahari Desert. The black folk of the of the Kalahari, and how they utilize every drop of water. And you can't just stop with the people who are living in this kind of environment. You have to go on to how the environment works on the people and how they work on their environment. I mean, you could look at this thing on the Oregon coast quite simply if you wanted to and say, yes, the sand was covering the highway and that's bad. So
we plant certain grasses and that stops the sand from moving and that's good.
And that's the end of it. You see, that's the end of it. But if you start going into the mechanics of how the United States Forest Service set up this project and all of the internal politics, undoubtedly, that were involved, I only know part of them, but I know enough to know there were quite a few more. Then you would probably have a story there, a Main Street type of story.
Yeah.
But I got off on a different kick because of the science fiction angle and the emphasis on ecology. It's been my belief for a long time that a man inflicts himself on his environment. That is, Western man.
I think we can see that just looking around us. The simple thing of beer used to be packed in bottles, which eventually disintegrated. Then it was packed in cans, and that had a 50-year half-life. And now it's packed in aluminum cans, and that lives forever. And we're gradually corrupting our. Yeah, well, all right, but we're gradually corrupting our environment as a result of
plastic,
that kind of thing.
Plastic is the thing that we. Do you know, Bev and I were up on the Washington coast last year, and an area unspoiled originally. Very primitive area up where the Macaw tribes live and so on. And even there, down among the driftwood logs on that primitive beach, that almost unspoiled beach, you frequently, much too frequently, come on these blue, orange, green, white plastic containers, Purex, ivory soap. They're virtually indestructible. And there they are. They float.
Well, man is then, as you view him, a creature who ecologically is a destructive force, a divisive force.
Well, we tend to think in Western culture. I'm talking about Western man.
Yeah.
You realize that. We tend to think that we can overcome nature by a mathematical means. We accumulate enough data, and we just subdue it.
Parameters of that data and subdue it.
We subdue nature. This is a one-pointed vision of man, because if you really start looking at man, Western man, you'll see that you could cut him right down the middle, and he's blind on that backside, you see.
This is a point that you made earlier, Bev, when talking about the death of the planetary ecologist in Dune being a very touching spot. I think you said it, very moving.
I thought also it was a very significant point. A lot of the story swung around this, how the ecologist dies. I thought it was very important that the planet killed the ecologist.
Even though the planet, even though the ecologist was technically able to subdue anything within that.
Well, there he lay, dying, understanding everything that was happening.
Exactly.
Much more than someone else dying on the desert would have. Complete understanding. I think it made it more horrible, the fact that he completely
that he knew what was happening to him and understood it and was technically capable of controlling it.
He knew it had gotten him.
Yes.
This, of course, was done deliberately for that purpose. To turn, it's a turning point of the whole book. but a pivot, you might say. And the very fact that Keynes, who is the Western man in my original construction of the book, sees all of these things happening to him as mechanical things, doesn't subtract from the fact that he is still a part of this system because it is observing him. He's lived out of rhythm with it, and he got in the trough of the wave and it tumbled on him.
And we are polluting our atmosphere, we're polluting our rivers, we're polluting our beaches because we don't understand the principles of ecology, among other things.
Well, ecology, as somebody said, and I used this, I don't recall, I'd like to attribute this, but I don't recall where I encountered it. I did read over 200 books as background on this novel. Somebody said that ecology is the science of understanding consequences.
I remember that.
Lovely expression.
Yeah, I remember that.
And of course, each of us individually is the product of everything that has happened to him. And this happened to me and hit me. And so I used it because as far as I was concerned, one of the purposes of this story was to delineate consequences of inflicting yourself upon a planet, upon your environment.
So you have a number of forces then that are inflicting themselves upon the planet. You have the Freeman forces. You have the forces of the House of Atreides, do you pronounce it?
Atreides.
Atreides. Parenthesis, I'd love to examine with you the possible implications of the House of Atreus in the Greek legend there, end parenthesis. And you have the off-planet forces of the Spacers Guild and the entire Imperium also as being forces inflicting themselves on this planet.
The name of the game is power, you see.
Yeah.
As it is today. We play the game today with counters called money. And we talk about laws of supply and demand and so on. And there is a law of supply and demand as long as you only have one form of exchange. But once you start getting other media of exchange, such as force, then the law of supply and demand gets different beats on it, different rhythms.
It may interest you to know that in fact, the major question on my final examination for my science fiction course this last 2 weeks ago was asking the class to examine the effects of power in its various forms, abuses, and uses in 2 of the major works read during the semester. And you're mentioning power just now as being the name of the game as far as Arrakis is concerned.
Yeah. You see, Western man has assumed that if you have, that all you need for any problem is enough force, power. And that there is no problem which won't submit to this approach. Even the problem of our own ignorance. Which, you see, throws it out the window right there. Because it's an asinine assumption. And it is the basic fallacy of Western man's approach to living. Now, I'm not saying that we immediately drop this and adopt Vedanta.
Although that might not be a bad idea.
No, we need what I would call a science of wisdom.
I think among the things that we need, and this is indicated to a certain extent in the novel, but we need a clear distinction in our minds, in the minds of Western man, between the ethical norm and the moral life. The moral life is subject to change. It is the law, etc., etc., etc. But the ethical norm are those things which we must do because they are the proper thing to do regardless of the law.
They're an abstract.
They are an abstract. And this conflict between the moral and the ethical norms we see obtaining in certain situations within Dune, as I recall.
Well, the moral,
at least I could extrapolate.
Yeah, that's correct. Well, the moral norm, as I saw it in Dune, was something that is imposed upon people by their environment.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as fixed as how many wives a man in this culture might be able to support and thereby have, or what possessions he can carry from one stopping place to another, and how this would control the moral laws that would be built up in society. We see it in our society, for example, out of our nomadic background and herdsman background. We see all kinds of moral injunctions which grew up out of that and which we accept today logically. I'm not trying to denigrate them, but we can trace them this way. Now, this is where moral law comes from. Ethical law takes a step in another direction. And it says that I, the thinking animal, see that the logical consequences of these moral actions are such and so, and maybe I better modify the moral law slightly by a higher ethical law.
I find this then in one of the in some of the internal conflicts which are bothering Paul.
Yeah.
That the ethical norm which he sees as being one of, say, absolute rightness, as opposed with the law of moral necessity, and these are clashing in him. These are tensions at work within Paul, which cause him, I think, to have a depth of characterization that you do not normally find within the normal science fiction novel.
You've hit on, of course, the way the character of Paul was constructed. It was a conflict between absolutes and the necessity of the moment.
Yeah.
And
it's almost an existential necessity, incidentally, as I caught it, as I read it.
That's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
And
absolutely.
Gee, thanks.
Now, you see, this is an exercise in showing up, you might say, the fallacy of absolutism.
Even to be absolute about being non-absolute. Because Paul is bothered with that very problem.
That's right.
How absolute can he be, and yet in his relationships with his subordinates, with Stilgar, for example. If he's too absolute, he loses, he gains, how did you put it in the novel? He sees the loss of a friend and the gain of a worshiper almost. He
gains he loses a friend. And gains a worshiper.
A worshiper, yes. And this kind of conflict, if he's too absolute here and non-absolute there, or in the necessity, or no, when the tribe tries to force upon Paul the apparent necessity for killing Stilgar, and he has to talk the tribe out of one of their tribal rules in order
to... A moral.
Yeah. Right.
A moral rule.
A moral rule.
And you see how the moral rule was developed out of the necessities of their background.
Exactly.
And he has given them then an ethical rule.
Yes. And yet this conflict is continual within Paul, I think. And it makes, I think, for certain added dimensions in the novel that, again, the normal science fiction novel does not have. Well, you began this then in 53, and you began doing research and filling file folders with facts and... extrapolating to the sand dune planet. Tell me further about the writing process itself.
Well, this was the first book where I really started carefully applying these ideas about the building of a rhythm within a story.
Would you just define this a little bit more for me?
I will. I'll be specific about it. And I can use an analogy which is familiar to both of us, poetry. Right. But it is used only as an analogy.
Okay.
You know how you choose a word in a given poem to control the beat of the poem.
Are you familiar with Hopkins' poem, The Windhover? If not, I'll get it out for you later and show you how there is one word in there which absolutely controls the total poem.
Yeah. This happens in many poems.
Many poems.
Yeah. And the poem then develops a certain fixed rhythm. Now, by changing the phraseology, the placement of words, you can change that rhythm. You can slow it down, you can speed it up. Well, there's an analogous thing in prose. I think this is quite easily defensible. That length of sentence, number one. Modifying clauses.
Variety of sentence structure.
Variety of sentence structure. All of these things control the pace of controlled reading or controlled silent reading or oral. And I work orally because I think that the language was spoken long before it was written. And I think that unconsciously we still accept it as an oral transmission.
That's something I'm going to have to try with some of my classes, is reading parts of Dune aloud to them. I've done this. I do this as a standard device when I teach Joyce or Yeats or Eliot. I read great gobs of it aloud in class.
Well, this was done deliberately as to control that oral pace. By the length of sentence, by the variety of sentence, by the words in the sentence, whether long, convoluted words or short, chopping words.
Anglo-Saxon.
Anglo-Saxon is against Latin.
Latin.
I control the pace. So I have several rhythms built into the story deliberately. One is a long-term rhythm. And we'll get to the ending of the book in a moment. The ending is camp. High camp. Deliberately, and a number of people, interestingly, have seen it. I wanted to say...
I found it sheer action, almost for the sake of action.
Yes.
And overly dramatic, maybe. And, you know, in the future they will call us wives. I said, yeah, almost. But you call it high camp. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Well, I wanted to turn the story around on itself, but in two very specific ways. And obviously, you don't limit if you do the way it turns, if you do that. Even if you do one way that you know of. One, I was poking a little fun at the idea of the person who always sees things verbally and must write about them and record them, you know, the historicity of anything that happens. You see, you're not living it, you're recording it.
Yeah.
You see.
Just as we're doing right now.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The man who never sees anything except through his
Yeah, but we're having a good...
Say that again, please.
The man who never sees anything except through his camera viewer. He sees the whole world. You see him just through that little square box.
Right.
Yeah. So I wanted to kind of have a little snicker about this, you see, right at the end. And you detected that sheer action treatment there. And you see how this does what I'm describing.
Yes. And that is a limited point of view, actually, the sheer action treatment.
Yeah, that's right. And also, by making it a man-to-man battle at that point between Paul, who is an extremely complex character, and this almost stick figure, Black, you see.
Who is sort of, in many ways, Paul's counterpart.
Exactly.
He's a foil in the classic sense of the word.
A foil in the classic sense in other places. Right. But at this point, he becomes that impossible thing, that non-existent thing, the absolute evil.
Yeah.
You see. And so we turn the whole thing whirling backward through the story. There was another thing there. In the pacing of the story, it was very slow at the beginning. It's a coital rhythm all the way through the story.
It's a what?
A coital rhythm.
Okay.
Very slow. Pace increasing all the way through. And when you get to the ending of it, I've chopped it at a non-breaking point so that the person reading the story skids out of the story, trailing bits of it with him. And on this, I know I was successful because people come to me and say they want more. And
I have said this to my classes, that in many ways, as satisfying as Dune is, I find it unsatisfying because there are so many unanswered questions. You don't tie up the loose ends of, say, Paul's sister, unless you read what is the Huntress of a Thousand Worlds? That marvelous little footnote, Princess Alia, or several other things. The whole question of the Spacing Guild itself and how it got to be the way it was is handled very,
Well, let's examine something as far as fiction in general is concerned. Now, there are other reasons why stories are remembered, and I'm talking about story in the classic sense of the jongleur who goes from castle to castle to earn his meal.
All right.
Entertainment.
Sure.
The stories that are remembered are the ones that strike sparks from your mind, one way or another. It's like a grinding wheel. They touch you and sparks fly.
Whether this be something like The Miller's Tale of Chaucer or Sir Gawain and the Graine Knicht,
Yes,
please.
indeed.
Well, we could adduce thousands of other examples up to, say, Treasure Island or what you will. There's sparks there, okay? I understand your term.
Now, we all have stories that we go on with after finishing reading them. As children, we can remember playing Treasure Island.
Right. Or playing Tom Sawyer.
Or Tom Sawyer. Any of these. We remember playing these. The story stayed with us. The characters and their conflicts and their joys, their play, all stayed with us.
And it enkindled sparks in our own imagination so that
we
were then active in creative play.
That's exactly right. We went on and told the story ourselves.
Yeah.
Now, I deliberately did this in Dune for that purpose. I want the person to go on and construct for himself all of these marvelous flights of fantasy and imagination. I want him to you see, you haven't had the Spacing Guild explained completely, just enough so that you know its existence. Now, with lots of people, they've got to complete this.
Yes.
So they build it up in their own minds.
Yeah.
Now, this is right out of the story, though, you see.
Yeah. Or the whole...
The sparks have flown.
Bene Gesserit, you pronounce it?
Bene Gesserit, yeah.
Bene Gesserit. Their whole mystique and so on is relatively unexplained. Why do they want the Kwisatz Haderach in the first place, you see, is relatively...
The name of the game is power.
Yeah. And they want power. That explains it to a certain extent, but...
They want power in a specific way. You know, I've always been amazed by the statement, or by the label, psychological warfare. There can be no such thing as psychological warfare. If you develop a psychological weapon sufficiently that it is destructive to any potential enemy, it will destroy you with the enemy. It's a two-edged sword without a handle, and if you grab it hard enough to wield it, you're going to...
It's just self-destructive.
Yes.
So we could have a variation on the Lord Acton notion. Power corrupts both the user and the receiver of the power, both, absolutely.
Right. Acton saw it.
Yeah. How interesting. I hadn't thought of who power corrupts.
Now, the Bene Gesserit see this. You see how they keep themselves in the background.
Yes, that's true.
They want a user of power they can control.
I see. With safety to them.
That's right. It's a safety device, you see.
Yeah.
And I say this in several ways, not in this way.
Yeah.
Not in this blatant, way, but implying it with all of its permutations, because there's much more to this. We could go on for several hours discussing this aspect of it.
Yeah, the whole attitude of Reverend Mother Gaius Moyam, for example, Helen Gaius Moyam. Yes, I see how we could, various aspects of it. Well, I'd like to I'd like to examine this a little bit further in some of the religious constructs.
Before we get into that,
Okay.
let me tell you something. I was up at Sonoma State last month to talk to a class up there. And the question that seemed to attract the most attention from the class, somebody asked back there, what's all this nonsense about controlling people with voice? And there seemed to be a lot of agreement with this point of view, that it's impossible to do this. And so I said, we do it all the time.
Of course we do.
And it's amazing to me that anybody could even begin to question this as a fact of our existence. And they couldn't see it. So I said, well, I'll give you an example. I'm going to describe a man to you. You know this man. And I'm going to give you a task of controlling him by voice after I've described him and after you recognize him. I said, this is a man who was in World War I as a sergeant, came home from World War I to his small town in the Midwest, married his childhood sweetheart, and went into his father's business, raised 2 children whom he didn't understand, and they don't understand him. He joined the VFW and the Legion, went on every picnic, every convention, lived by the double standard, he thought. Now, on the telephone, strictly by voice, I want you to make him mad.
Oink, oink, oink.
Or any one of 100
variations.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Simplest thing in the world.
Yeah.
Now, what we're saying here is that, see, I've drawn a gross caricature.
Of course.
But we're saying that if you know the individual well enough, if you know the subtleties of his strengths and weaknesses, that merely by the way you cast your voice, by the words you select,
by the intonations,
whatever,
yeah. Right.
you can control him. Now, if you can do it in a gross way, obviously, with refinement, you can do it in much more subtle fashion, and it's done all the time in politics.
And this is one of the techniques, incidentally, that science fiction, I think, does. It takes a possibility or something that does actually exist today and extrapolates from that, perhaps refines it, makes it more specific.
The science of control by voice.
Yeah,
Isn't there
exactly.
a word in semantics for these messages that we get across? What was that?
Meta
Meta-message.
Yeah, meta-message.
Meta message?
It's a well-recognized thing in semantics, and you see it. Hayakawa uses the example of you've met somebody for the first time, maybe in a business meeting, at a convention, and you get acquainted and you're speaking, you exchange views. At the end of it, you say, we must get together for lunch sometime. Now, under one example of this, the fellow will call you the next week, or you'll call him, and you will get together for lunch. And he knows he's supposed to call you and make this luncheon date. Under the other example of this same phrase, he knows that this is goodbye, I don't care to talk to you anymore. But it's the same phrase.
And they're both polite.
They're both polite.
Oh, yes.
And this is the meta message.
Yeah. The hidden message underneath the message, and
Yeah,
so
that's
on.
right.
Yeah, I can understand that. Well, I had no trouble understanding that question of the voice as I read the novel, because among the other things which the novel gave to me was the whole question of communication and how we communicate on multiple levels, whether it be Paul communicating by shedding a tear, that's an act of communication, on a very profound level to the Freeman. But or the communication of the voice, or the communication by sword, or the communication by a dozen different ways that we all do constantly, as we're doing in this room right now. So you're communicating, in one sense, by the way you're both watching me as I speak, and watching Frank and watching the recorder and watching what you're doing with your hands. They're all sorts of communications, just as I'm communicating and you are in a dozen, hundreds of hidden different ways. I had no problem with that in the novel, and I thought it was rather well done. Let me go off on another parenthesis here. Did you ever read the novel Nostromo by Conrad?
No.
I was reminded very much as I read Dune for the first time of the reaction that I had when I first read Nostromo. I think that Nostromo is one of, if probably Conrad's greatest novel, is certainly his most artistic achievement, as well as his most profound. And I found myself thinking about Nostromo as I read Dune.
Now I'm going to have to read it.
Well, I mean that's very high praise, because Nostromo is ultimately the creation of an entire universe. It is the country of Costaguana in Central America. There is one thing in this country of Costaguana that influences everybody, and it is the presence of a gigantic silver mine. And the silver corrupts everybody in the country in one way or another. It corrupts the British people who are running the silver mine. It corrupts the incorruptible Nostromo, our man, who is the sort of a folk hero of the thing.
Yeah.
It corrupts everybody. It totally controls the country. And in watching how these people interrelate to the problem of a silver mine. And the parallels there, you see, between Dune and Nostromo, to me, as I read it, as a professor of English, were very strong. And this is one of the things I object to among my own compatriots, is that they are unable to see that something like Nostromo is, in a very real sense, a type of science fiction. We have created a mythical country based upon reality.
Yeah.
Where the people react in certain ways to things which we would react to in other ways, but it's said over here, just as the Freemen react to...
Oh, yes. It's my contention that in, especially in Dune, and Dune is an exposition of this point, that man himself is going to change. We have changed. But our changes, the actual basic change, is a gradual climb. Now, I don't see this as progress. I see it as a sort of entropy and as a growth of complexity. But that this is such a slow process that in thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years, we would still recognize the emotions, the reactions, all of these things. And given any set of forces which you can delineate, the silver mine, the geriatric spice,
right,
the existence of certain hard lines of power control and communication.
As perhaps oversimplified by, say, the Harkonnens versus the Atreides.
Yes.
Families.
Yeah. You have a classical feudal system here. It's my contention that feudalism is a natural condition of human beings. Not that it is the only condition, not that it is the right condition, but it is just a way we have of falling into organizations. I like to use the example of the Berlin Museum beavers. You ever come across this?
No.
Well, the numbers are going to be wrong here, but it's on this order.
Yeah.
Before World War II, there were a number of families of beaver in the Berlin Museum. They were European beaver. They had been in there, raised in captivity, for something on the order of 70 beaver generations in cages. But World War II came along and a bomb freed some of them into the countryside. What did they do? They went out and they started building dams.
Wow. Wow.
Now, tribal organization. Feudalism is tribal organization.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm talking about. So tribal organization is a natural organization of humankind.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to fall into it, given any chance at all, given the proper stresses or given the proper lack of stresses.
And I think we could extrapolate from that notion and say we have many more feudal or tribal aspects in our society than we might have otherwise thought about it. I would think that the existence of the Roman Catholic Church in its feudal state, as long as it has existed, is sort of proof of what you're saying.
The hippies are a proof of it.
Look
Look at the organization they set up. It's a tribal organization.
A business office is feudal.
Yeah, a company is feudal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A university, perhaps?
Oh, yes, indeed. An English department. Very true.
Well, of course, what we're doing here is oversimplifying.
Yes.
The complexities of it and the variations on the theme are multitude.
Mm-hmm.
But the framework is there. The skeleton is there. And you can recognize that skeleton.
Mm-hmm.
So I set up the situation in Dune where the natural evolvement was a classic feudalism.
Mm-hmm.
And for a very specific purpose. I wanted the lines of power to be clear.
Yeah. At the same time, feudal lines of power were extremely complicated. I don't mean to contradict you, but
no, I understand what you're saying. That's
while
why I
they
said
were simple, they were nonetheless multi-leveled.
Yes.
As you indicate with Baron Harkonnen,
Yes.
and the Navarone and so on. All of these things of the relationship to the Imperium. You want to go back to the 14th century in England, to the War of the Roses.
No, by clear, in this, I meant in this sense, recognizable by anybody who knows the first damn thing about history.
Precisely. The fief is a set of obligations from top to bottom and from bottom to top, mutual back and forth, ultimately.
Yeah, it's a feedback situation.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And this kind of thing, the kind of loyalty that, say, Gurney Halleck gave Paul, or gave Paul's father, this is the kind of thing that you...
The loyalty to the family.
Yeah, certainly. Mm-hmm. And I am the rightful Duke of Atreides.
Yes.
At the very end of the thing. Mm-hmm. Not as he is speaking to the Sardaukar. Did you pronounce it?
The Sardaukar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very interesting. I know my students have had a lot of fun tracing down the background of the Freeman as far back as they can from the hints you drop in the novel, and coming to the surprise, delighted surprise, that they were once probably on Seleucus Secundus, and that this accounts for part of the way they are, even the hardening there. And further, tracing the life cycle of Shai-Hulud is really an interesting thing for them, because you don't quite complete the whole thing in your in the appendices.
Of course, what have I set up there? We know our information about the cyclic nature, the interdependence of our own environment is still quite sketchy in many areas. But we do know this. We know that you need to create large bodies of sand, dust, and whatnot.
Yeah.
You need water action. Some, anyway.
Yeah.
And so I've set up multitudes of creatures who substitute for this.
Yeah.
Quite logical.
Yeah. Why not?
They do this. And I've postulated that in one vector of their life circle, water is poison to them.
Right.
We see this sort of thing on planet Earth right now, where a creature can live in one environment, in one vector, but that environment will kill it in another vector. Mm-hmm. The Anopheles mosquito is a good example. And it doesn't take much of a stretch of the imagination to carry this further in that classic science fiction way, saying that given other circumstances,
Right.
on another planet, a creature could develop something that we could see was analogous to this, but would do these other things. Now, there's another element of Shai-Hulud too. Shai-Hulud serves a specific function, among other things in the story, but a specific leitmotif function.
All right.
It's the unthinking beast. It's the black beast. It's the personification of the bull in the arena. Not the way the bull in the arena actually is, but the
The
personification.
mystique of the back.
The mystique of it, and there it is.
I never took... The black beast has connotations that I never gave it. Maybe it's my taking it wrong from your terminology. It's the mythic beast. It's the archetypal beast. Is that
The
what you mean
archetypal
by,
beast.
Is that
Now
what you mean
bring
by black beast?
That's right. Now bring this up
Okay.
because of your mention earlier of the tracing the archetypal backgrounds.
Yeah.
I meant it classically. The archetypal black beast, the one that lives underground in the cavern with the gold.
I see. Okay, right.
See?
Well, this is the dragon Beowulf who lives in a cave
Yeah,
guarding
with
gold.
the golden dagger.
Right, precisely. Incidentally, Frank Baum used in one of his Oz books, used the dragon hoarding gold, guarding gold, believe it or not.
Yeah. Well, that was why
Yeah.
I put this in there.
Mhm.
It's a familiar
And
theme.
gold, of course, becomes the geriatric spice.
That's right.
In another
Yeah.
sense. Which I once figured out, and one of my students figured out, that the geriatric spice itself is probably the defecated matter of Shai-Hulud. In one of its vectors. or it might have been, no, not in defecated matter, but also, no, it was the eggs, perhaps, waiting, and that's why they're guarded, among other things.
Look at the value of that corner.
Yeah, well, true. They have lots of, kids have lots of fun with this.
Of course, and I did that deliberately.
Sure.
The value of a good story in the entertainment sense is how much of this it tips off, how much it starts rolling,
Sure.
so that you start creating your own story.
Sure.
The one that's in all of us, you see.
And in that sense, there is no right answer to the final, let's say, complete life cycle of Shai-Hulud.
Yeah, do you want me to pin it down for you? I can. I mean, I had it in mind.
You had it in mind?
Yeah, but
I had it worked out too. Let's compare notes.
well, I'd be interested before I say anything to hear what you have to say.
I got to get my book. I'm going to turn this off for a minute. Now we're back again. We were talking about the archetypal patterns in Dune for a moment. Off on this tangent now.
Well, we got onto the sequel for a moment.
Yeah.
And there's a point here that I think should be made. Campbell turned down the sequel. Now, his argument was that I had created an anti-hero in Paul in the sequel. And he has built his magazine. I'm oversimplifying, grossly oversimplifying,
Sure.
but this is the essence of it, really, and truthfully accurate.
Yeah.
That he had built his magazine on the hero. Now, it's my contention that the difference between a hero and an anti-hero is where you stop the story. And if you're true to life, giving these ingredients, then the story goes on, because human beings go on. Now, you can confine your story to one individual. And therefore, as far as he's concerned, story begins with birth and ends with death. But if you're dealing with larger movements...
The parameters are much broader.
That's right, as they are in this book.
Yeah.
Then there is no real ending. It's just a place where you stop the story. And one of the reasons, by the way, why in the book Dune, I stop it the way I do. Deliberately building up a carrying momentum as though you were going down a slide. And then just chopping it.
To a moment of triumph, and then that's it.
And you skid out of the story
Yeah.
with all of this clinging to you.
Yeah. I can see that, yeah. But as I understand the Jungian archetypal pattern, you know, the Lord Raglan steps of the hero, Dune takes up about the first 15 of them, more or less. And if I know nothing about the sequel, other than the few words you've told me, but I would be willing to predict that if you follow the pattern, the archetypal hero pattern, he goes through many of the things that Lord Raglan sets out in the notion of the hero and the quest hero. Ultimately, Paul has to die. It's a question of how and under what circumstances, and probably as a result of some of these tensions which have been previously operating.
Yes, several of them. And one of them, of course, is the tension of prognostication, prediction.
This is foreshadowed in here.
Yeah.
He never sees his own death moment, but he's always concerned about it.
Yeah. We bring this, that's right, we bring this to a head. This idea that I'm expounding, that, you know, when you talk to the average individual and he says, oh, God, if I could only know everything that's going to happen tomorrow, wouldn't that be wonderful?
Oh,
what he is talking about is the fifth race at Hialeah.
Yeah. Or will that girl say yes or no?
That's right. That's what he's talking about. And he doesn't really want to know everything that's going to happen tomorrow. Because this is precisely what I do to Paul. We carry this to its logical outcome. And we reach a point in the sequel where he is physically blinded, is without sight. I think this is what set Campbell off aside.
Oh, becomes an anti-hero in that sense.
Yeah. But here is Paul. He's physically blinded, and yet he knows everything that's going to happen. He's lived this one before. Well, think of how boring that is. But think of how mysterious and terrifying it would be to
everybody else. Sure.
Yes, a guy. It would be as though I, without sight, you could see I have nothing but a couple of sockets here, and my wife comes in and picks up a cigarette out of a package. I lean over and light it for her.
And say it's a Pall Mall.
Yes. Say, you're back to Pall Malls.
Yeah.
Paul does such things as grabbing a microphone out of a trooper's hands and relaying orders immediately after the accident in which his eyes are lost. And greeting people in the hallway as he passes them. And of course, it builds up this terrifying godhead among the people around him, but it also foreshadows their turning against him, because if a person really does this sort of thing to you, you're going to get away from him one way or another.
They crucify him.
Yeah.
In many ways they would. I could see this, and this would lead us to all sorts of possible symbolic interpretations of knowledge and so on, going back to the Oedipal notion.
Yes, it's my contention.
And I've always wondered about the Oedipal aspects of the
they're there
on the novel, but let's not go into that right now.
They're there and deliberately.
Yeah.
No, it's my contention. I think I'm probably right on this, that the thing that got to Campbell was not that I had an anti-hero in this sense, but that I had destroyed one of his gods.
Oh.
See, because prediction and esp.
Oh, of course. With Campbell, that's, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You see, if you know the magazine and his editorial.
Sure. And I've been reading it since 1940.
All right. Then you know that he is completely devoted to this idea.
Yeah.
And I'm not arguing against him, but I'm merely saying that this is his point of view. And this pokes a great deal of fun, and not so much fun as it pokes a big hole in the whole theory. That would be great to know everything that's going to happen tomorrow.
And so he rejected it.
Isn't
that interesting?
But Galaxy snapped it right up and paid Campbell's rates.
Huh. Well. Looking for another nebula for that one?
I don't know. I didn't even look for a nebula for the first one. I didn't write it with that in mind. My chief concern is to tell a good story. It really is.
Virginia Heinlein says that every time that Bob wanders away, she says, "Cut to the chase."
Yeah, I heard them say that. This is a classic Hollywood approach.
Yeah. Well, could we go back a little bit and tell us more about the novel as it developed in your mind?
But you were going to do something.
Oh, I was going to trace Shai Hulud for you. Well, I can't quite do it completely without referring to the text, and I'm afraid that most of it is given in the text. But I think that the question of the sand trout and the
That's right.
is one of the vectors.
Mm-hmm.
From the sand trout to the dry leathery to the sand trout. No, dry leathery thing. Sand trout to little maker to a
to the worm, to the big one.
to the yes. Well, but it goes through. Does little maker just go directly into the worm, or is there another?
No, it goes directly.
Directly
It's
into
a
the
matter
worm.
of growth process from
Growth,
there.
all right. To Shai Hulud itself, and then Shai Hulud spice, I think, becomes the eggs.
Well, the spice, as I
Spermatic
conceived,
material.
the spice, as I conceived it, was necessary for the development from, let's say, the pupal stage.
Yeah.
To go beyond the pupal stage, they had to be in the presence of the spice. Well, that's the way I conceived it
I
originally.
see.
Mm-hmm.
I
That's
think the
why it's
spice
so-
itself is almost as being spermatic material.
That's right. Mm-hmm. That's
and
right.
then
Exactly
the spice growing into the, well, ultimately little maker,
right. Mm-hmm.
as I saw it.
Is that something like royal honey, royal nectar?
No, the way I saw it is slightly different, but the spice in the presence of a dead worm.
Yes, who killed by the water of life.
That's
Then
right.
this becomes, and you're off in the spice blow.
That's right.
Right.
This
Okay.
becomes
Yeah.
the
Mhm.
seed of the new life cycle.
Yeah. Mhm. It's almost orgasmic in that sense.
That's right.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
Probably deliberately so.
Yeah, I built these things in there
Yeah.
deliberately, all the way through it.
How interesting. Well, if we can go back then and talk about a little bit more about the formation of the novel from, say, 1953 and the germinal ideas and your file folders and so on. We were up to about there a little while ago.
Well, I'm not too
Clear
concerned.
on dates or anything.
dates,
Yeah.
but they don't concern me.
No.
I'm more involved with the actual
Well,
piece
how
of
long-
paper in front of you.
All right. How long a writing process did this take then, from the time this began till the time you
The
say,
actual
finished?
physical writing
Mm-hmm.
process? About 2 years.
About 2 years.
Mhm.
You wrote it when you were in Mexico?
No.
Oh.
I wrote it here.
Wrote it here.
But I had the idea with me in Mexico, was adding to it. You see, we're talking about two different things here. The accumulation of
Data and the physical writing.
and the
process.
physical,
Right.
sitting down in front of the paper and actually putting a story down.
Mhm.
It's almost as though you're filling a container.
I see. That has been pretty well built up at that
Yeah.
time. It's interesting. Harry Harrison describes the writing process with him rather well in a tape I made with him a few months ago. He is absolutely uninterruptible from, say, 12:30 in the afternoon until 5 o'clock at night. Because the ideas, as they form in his mind, sort of become into the extensions of his excuse me, fingers in the typewriter, and that they are up here, and that and that any interruption, whether it be a telephone ringing or his wife knocking at the door or anything at all, is liable to shatter that idea as it transforms itself into paper.
This is a very evanescent thing.
Yeah, very.
And I have to fight this. But Bev is very nice to me about this. She keeps the...
A writer's children are always, they learn to tiptoe and is daddy writing?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you don't have to say be quiet, you say your father is writing in silence.
Uh-huh. What is your writing schedule?
Well, it varies. Depends on what I'm doing writing for the magazine down here. But as a general rule, it goes like this. I'll get home somewhere around 5 o'clock. When Bev is here, when she's not working, as she has been the last couple of weeks, she'll have dinner ready at that time, or very close to that time. I'll then take an hour's nap, and then work, sometimes till 1 o'clock in the morning. Then I hit the sack and get up. And sometimes, if the story is strong in me, I get up in the morning and write. Get up at 5 o'clock in the morning or so and write for an hour or two sometimes before going down to San Francisco.
Yeah.
And this is the thing I want to get out of, because I can write 8 hours a day in 2 bursts. And I don't see any reason why I shouldn't be doing what I want, writing what I want to write during those times. I don't envision supporting myself entirely by science fiction writing in the sense of writing only science fiction. Because I have other axes to grind too.
Yeah.
I'm going to do a non-fiction book on air pollution, for example. I'm really hipped on this ecology thing. The consequences of some of the things that we're doing to our planet. And I don't mean in the lock it up and throw it away sense of the classic conservationist. In other words, turn it all into wilderness. I don't mean that. But there are ways of living with our planet, not against it. And this is the attitude that we have to develop. And it is an attitude.
Thank you, Mr. Keynes. Pardon, Keynes.
No, it is an attitude.
Sure.
It's something that has to be ingrained into us as children.
As my wife is fond of telling my children, a fountain pen is not a screwdriver.
Very good.
And each has its own purpose for whatever it may be. And if you misuse that thing, it will turn around and bite you. You'll ruin a screwdriver or ruin a fountain pen in trying to make it work like a screwdriver. And we're rapidly ruining our air, our water, our planet.
I've found that you were talking about the economics of writing and selling. Dune has made us at this point about $15,000 since the first sale.
This includes the sale of, what was it, something like 8 chapters to Campbell.
That's right.
By the way, I did not read it in analog. I read it first in book form. How much of it did appear in
almost all of it.
Almost all of it.
Okay. In fact, in one sense, a little more, because there were capsule recapitulations, the synopses.
Oh, yes. Did you write those?
Yes, I did. The way it comes in, I've found, and this is broad, for a novel, it makes somewhere between $5,000 and $7,000 in the first 12 months of sale. And this depends on how far you sell it, how many times you sell it. Then I found that with my own work, it'll go on earning for a long time. We received several $100s out of Dragon in the Sea this last year.
Is that right?
Yeah. Good old Dragon.
Yeah, it's still one of my favorites. Yeah, still one of my favorites.
Well, it's still selling. Selling beautifully in Japan.
I understand that you speak Japanese.
No.
No? Where did I hear that?
No, I don't speak Japanese. I can read a bit of ideogram.
So desu ka.
So desu ka.
Hi.
But I was raised with Japanese Americans in the Pacific Northwest, in an area where there were a great many of them. Let's put it that way. A place called Fife, between Seattle and Tacoma. And
that's up near Glorious Tumwater.
Yes, it's north of Tumwater. An Ole fan. If I'd known, I would have brought in a mess of beer. So, by the way, we have another wine in there. Would you like?
No, I'm going to stick to coffee for a while.
Okay.
Thanks.
Um,
I'll be up all night reading, but then what difference does it make?
well, anyway, I was raised with them and eat in Japanese, and I know a few phrases.
Yeah.
I
I learned quite a. Well, we were speaking of your writing plans for the future. You say the sequel to Dune will be out this fall sometime,
or earlier.
or earlier.
Yeah. Possibly in October, possibly earlier. There's some question. I requested that it be moved up a bit, and I'm not sure that everyone's in agreement. And maybe that's best. I mean, I'm not. I just thought it would be a better idea for several reasons that they'd publish it earlier. One of the reasons is that I have built a Dune tarot into the sequel.
Do that one again.
You know what the tarot deck is?
Oh, of course, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, I missed that. Yeah.
And I built a Dune tarot into it, and that's hot right now.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking economically, they ought to capitalize on
Oh,
it.
sure. Why not?
Mhm.
A Dune tarot. Well, see, I teach Yeats and Eliot and
Of course.
so on, so I'm
Yeah.
Yeah.
very
You're very
familiar with the
familiar.
tarot.
Yeah.
Right. In
It's my
fact, I own my own private deck, and
We have one.
Yeah.
It's my contention that if you immerse a society in a great deal of what we call fortune telling, that you cloud the whole process.
hmm.
You see, what happened in
Yeah.
classic times, in Greek historic times, when the oracle was had terrifying accuracy.
The Oedipus cycle, for example.
There weren't a lot of oracles around. You went to Delphi,
Delphi, right?
or to the local madman.
Yeah. Who looked at the birds and cast a few auguries here and there.
Yeah, and who might kill a chicken and look at the entrails.
Or note which way the blood spurts from the neck
Yes,
as you cut it
that's
off.
right.
Yeah.
Any one of these methods, which I call ignition principles, as far as prediction is concerned. See, I contend that there is such a thing, that you can do it. Whether you do it by, a subliminal thing, petite perception, or whether it is a...
You used the petite perception in that scene in the conservatory incident. I thought it was rather well done. With Countess Fenring,
That's right.
leaving that thing for Lady Jessica to pick up. End parenthesis.
Yeah, that's right. Well, whether our predictive faculties are prophecy, and we've had our prophets, is a product of an accumulation, in the sense of a computer's accumulating data,
Yeah.
or something mystical in the sense that it's unexplained, thus far unexplained. I'm looking at it through Western eyes now. You can undoubtedly see that it's a mechanical scientific principle, and if you get enough data to bear on it, you'll understand it. Now, this doesn't necessarily follow, of course, that we can understand everything in the universe. Ask me about what I think is the basic fallacy in science.
All right. What is the basic fallacy in science? Tell us, pray tell.
You want a prognostication? Okay. I think it's the idea that we can invent. Of course, science fiction is based on this. The idea that we can invent anything we imagine, and having invented it, we must use it.
And then live by the consequences of it.
Exactly. Yeah. Now this is the Western fallacy.
And this is one of the great things about the East, that it does not
So, of course, we frown on it because they achieve their ignition by methods that we can see are hogwash.
Right, or we misinterpret their methods. For example, if we were to consider, say, the tantric yoga, all we would think of is that, they're achieving nirvana by means of sex, and it's much more than that.
Yeah.
For as one specific example, we take only one aspect of it and make sort of an end out of it.
Or hell, man, you go back to the slitting the neck of the chicken and watching which way the blood spurts.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying by ignition? This ignites a. You see, you have to have confidence that you can do it. You have to believe you can do it. And believing you can do it, the process is ignited by any one of a million methods. We've experimented with many. The direction the birds fly or any of this, you see.
Well, I had a student a few years ago whose wife was so accurate with the tarot deck that she stopped using it completely.
I must tell you
something. She frightened herself.
I terrified a gal one time when I was about 17. We were sitting in her aunt's house. And her aunt and an uncle were out of sight, but within hearing distance, down in some stacks in their library, which was nearby. And we were sitting across from each other on hassocks. The mouth of the fireplace, a big stone fireplace between us, down to embers. And we'd been out on a date, and I'd brought her home. And we didn't have anything going. She was just a gal I knew. I happened to have had a crush on her younger sister, and she knew it. And unrequited love at 17 is a hideous thing,
Oh, yes.
Anyway, there was a great upsurge of Rhine consciousness at the time, predicting the cards. Of course, our interpretation of predicting the cards was, we only knew one kind of cards. That was a deck of cards.
Sure.
So she broke out a brand new deck of cards and shuffled them. We'd been talking about it on the way home. And quite shadowy in the room. There was the firelight, and Pat was sitting across the fireplace, and the light from where her aunt and uncle were playing cribbage in the back in there. Both of them deaf, by the way. And you could hear this 15-2 and 2 is 4.
Right.
Coming
pair of 6.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there was a light from back in there, so she could see the cards. And she said, see if you can predict the cards. She'd been shuffling them, you see. So she picked up the first card. And I closed my eyes and I saw that card. So I told her that was it. She put it down. That was the card. I swear to you, Will, I went through that entire deck predicting every card that she was going to see, and there wasn't a failure at all. I told her every card, and I did it the same way every time. Now, whether I saw a reflection in her eyes, in other words, we go back to petit perception, or whether this was some actual keyed-in transmission, we were simpatico or something.
Tuned in on her wavelength.
Empathy was rampant in this atmosphere. I don't know what it was, but I predicted what the cards were. And I said, my goodness, I said, this is fascinating. Let's do it again. Shuffle them again. So she shuffled the deck again and cut them a few times, and we started going through them again. And we got down 5 or 6 cards into the deck, and suddenly she threw the whole deck down on the hearth of the fireplace and said, this scares me. I don't want to do this anymore.
Have you ever had that kind of success?
Never again. But it was the odds against being able to do this by anything but some unrecognized contact or force. I'm not ruling out the fact that I may have seen, she wasn't wearing glasses, but the light may have been such that without even recognizing it, I saw them, or a reflection of them in her eyes or something of that nature. This is possible.
There are more things twixt heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of.
Will!
Well, you expect things like that from an English teacher, don't you?
Not frequently.
Not frequently. I'd like to ask a couple of more questions. I wanted to talk about the religious constructs behind the novel. It's obvious that some of the Arabian mystique is there.
Yes.
and I think any perceptive reader can pick this up. But part of the question relates to the identity of Paul as an avatar, as a new Messiah,
Right.
or as a new prophet, or what you will. Would you care to talk about that a little?
Well, one of the threads in the story is to trace a possible way a Messiah is created in our society. And I hope I was successful in making it believable that here we have the entire process, or at least the large and some of the subtle elements of the construction of this, both from the individual standpoint and from the way society demands this of him. It's the reference in there, that the man must recognize the myth he's living in. Because the creation of an avatar is a myth-making process. We've done it in recent times. Look at what's happening to John F. Kennedy,
Oh, sure.
who was a very earthy, real,
Oh, yes.
and not totally holy man. Yes. Yeah. So here we have a likable person now, you see.
Yeah.
But real in the flesh and blood sense, who, by the process of immolation, becomes something larger than life, far larger than life.
Well,
And I've just explored all of as many permutations as I could recognize in the process.
well, I caught overtones of Lawrence of Arabia in the thing, for example.
He could very well have become an avatar for the Arabs.
Right.
If Lawrence of Arabia had died at the crucial moment of the British,
Say when Allenby walked into Jerusalem.
if he had died, if for example he had gone up and killed the people who were destroying his dream, walked into that conference and said, "Gentlemen, I have here under my jebala a surprise, bang, bang, bang," and he had been killed.
He'd have been deified.
He would have been deified. And it would have been the most terrifying thing the British had ever encountered, because the Arabs would have swept that entire peninsula with that sort of force behind them. One of the things we've done in our society is exploited this power. Western man has exploited this avatar power.
Well, if I could ask then one more question along this same line. You mentioned a little bit earlier that you studied comparative religion at one time, or
That's right.
were a student of it. Was it from your experience in reading in comparative religions that brought you to this particular notion of an avatar?
That was part of it. Of course, it was ignited by the ideas that I encountered in reading about desert societies.
Yeah.
And I think that the idea of the way Western society has exploited this force, we have, we've used it as quite consciously. We've sent out our missionaries and to do our dirty work for us, and then come along behind them with the certain belief that we are right in anything that we do.
Right.
Because God has told us so.
Yeah.
God in the person of the avatar.
Well, one last personal question then. If you don't mind. Do you profess any specific religion yourself? You mentioned Vedanta earlier, or other backgrounds. I'm a little curious, and if it's not at all pertinent, why say so?
Oh, I don't mind saying so. I mean, I don't really profess a religion in the sense that we normally recognize religion. I believe more in self-development in the Zen sense.
Well, I caught the Zen elements from time to time. I thought in Dune, and in fact, the whole Zen-Zuni school I thought was an aspect of that.
You know, don't you, that one element of the construction of this book, it's all the way through there, that I wrote certain parts of it in haiku and other poetical forms, and then expanded them to prose to create a pace
I haven't picked those out specifically, but I sort of caught something of that, and that's
Some of my friends have come back to me with examples out of it and said, "Was this a
haiku.
was this a haiku?"
Or a
And
tanka or something.
yeah, or a tanka.
Yeah.
And yes, they're in there.
Well, that's very good, and thank you very much. We certainly appreciate this.